On today's World Insight, Antonio Guterres gets unanimous approval for another 5 years as UN Secretary General. Does he have the tools to deal with mounting geopolitical tensions? And the policeman who killed George Floyd will soon hear a sentence, and Juneteenth is made a federal holiday. But do these actions simply paper over systemic racism in the U.S.? And the 100th anniversary of the CPC is just over a week away. How did the party rise to its current position, leading a world-class economy? We speak to a party historian to find out.
Welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The UN General Assembly unanimously elected Antonio Guterres to be in a second term as Secretary General on Friday. His new 5-year term begins on January 1st, 2022. Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a congratulatory message where he lauded UN for the universal, representative, and authoritative international role it plays in international affairs. The 72-year-old Portuguese succeeded Ban Ki-moon in January 2017, just weeks before Donald Trump became President of the United States. He has faced, of course, many challenges in his first term, including trying to end multiple wars and dealing with humanitarian crises in Syria and Yemen. Guterres also faced a surging in nationalism, an emergency in Myanmar, and global pandemic and its subsequent vaccination campaign. As many of these issues still remain, what can the UN do to have a bigger impact? For more, let's loop in our panelists. In New York, Jeffrey Sachs, professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development from Columbia University. And joining us in Beijing, Fu Jun, academic dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. First, I would like to have a few words with Professor Sachs. Your take on Mr. Guterres' second term.
Well, he earned a unanimous support of the world, not only a unanimous support of the P5, the permanent 5 members, but also support by acclamation in the General Assembly. He's an extremely skilled diplomat. He is a man of tremendous integrity. He's a hard worker in a very, very difficult period. So I think we're lucky to have him as Secretary General.
You served Professor Sachs as a special advisor for 3 Secretary Generals, starting from Mr. Annan, and then Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and now also later until 2018, Mr. Guterres. But this new term for the Secretary General of the United Nations might be witnessing a very different period of time in which the powers of the world might be going back into some kinds of Cold War as a result of the geopolitics. Do you think Mr. Guterres is equipped with the right skills to deal with that situation?
Well, he has the skills and absolutely the determination not to have the world divide, because we can't afford a new Cold War. We have so many issues on which the whole world needs to move forward, whether it's climate change or stopping this pandemic or protecting nature. When governments come together in Kunming later this year for the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have no time to lose with cold wars, with division, and with conflict.
However, Mr. Sachs, you know better than most of us about how important it is for members of the United Nations to be together on some of the key issues. Mr. Guterres, after being re-elected, he's been talking about 3 major tasks. One is COVID-19, climate change, and biodiversity. None of these, though, cannot be achieved without cooperation with the major powers. For example, China, United States, Russia, and some European unions, some of the others. And yet, many of these issues, even though with the same consensus, we haven't seen real steps of cooperation. How do you see the reality?
Well, the reality is not so good right now. The Biden administration has continued to really take a line of basic non-cooperation with China. And I think that this is, to my point of view, an unwise approach, one that the U.S. would regret, one that everybody would lose from. I keep urging in the United States more cooperation and especially dialogue right now, because we really need a lot of discussion on a lot of complex topics. These are topics that can be settled by talking past each other in speeches. It was even worse when we had a president who thought that Twitter was the way to communicate. That was a disaster for 4 years with Trump. At least President Biden stays off of Twitter, but it's not good enough to make speeches or to meet with allies. We have to meet with each other. And especially in the world right now, we have the European Union, China, the United States, the African Union, other parts of the world that absolutely have to sit down together. I think the G20 could be a useful framework. I was not happy with the G7 meeting that just took place. I thought, and I wrote afterwards, that I thought perhaps that should be the last of the G7 meetings. The G20 is a far more representative group. I would like the G20 to add the African Union as a key member. Then we get a great proportion of the world covered and still have it in a way that we could have a serious discussion and serious plans of action. So the situation is not easy right now. Secretary General's job is never easy. I've been 21 years watching closely. Every problem comes to a UN Secretary General, but not all the solutions are in hand. These are big power problems often that are therefore not solvable by the Secretary General. But I know morning, noon, and night, the problems come to the Secretary General of the UN.
Very true. One of the things Mr. Guterres, after being reelected, was talking about, he talked about the reduction of unnecessary bureaucracy. Now we know the Secretary General, after coming into the office for the past 4 years, have been restructuring some of the important presence of the United Nations. How have been these reforms be able to reduce so-called unnecessary bureaucracy?
I personally am more worried about the fact that the United Nations is systematically under-resourced because we do not have an adequate budget for the UN system. A lot of that has been under U.S. pressure for many years because the U.S. kept saying, cut the budget. But this is a bit ridiculous that the core budget of the United Nations, not counting peacekeeping and other voluntary contributions, is only around $3 billion a year, less than half a dollar U.S. per person on the planet per year. Well, you can't run a multilateral system without investing in it. I'm conscious of the fact that New York City, my city, has a budget of $100 billion a year, more than 30 times the UN budget. So my own view as an economist is we need more resources by all the major countries, China, the United States, European Union, and others, to contribute to make multilateralism effective, to make institutions like WHO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNESCO, other critical parts of the UN work effectively. And there's been a lot of talk and a lot of pressure about lean budgets and so forth. But I want to speak about the need to invest.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Stay with us. We're going to have now also Professor Fu Jun from Peking University joining us. Professor Fu, good to see you. Now you've been listening to Professor Sachs talking about his views of the United Nations and his future mission. Now, to you, Professor Fu, what do you think about the equity issue that has been once and again reiterated by the current Secretary General's second term?
Well, the equity issue is very important because when you look at all countries around the world, harsh reality is that countries are during different stages of development. So it is very important for the advanced economies to lend a helping hands to those less developed countries to run forward, so that you have both development, you also have a sense of equity, so that we can move together forward. My observing of climate change is that while we have carbon equity now increasingly moving towards carbon neutrality, but behind that, we still need to strike a balance between carbon equity and the carbon neutrality. The implication is that it is so critical for advanced economies to have technology transfer to developing world so that we can move together.
You already touched on one thing, but I do want to emphasize about the vaccines. We have seen the lack of equity in terms of distribution of vaccines worldwide. This is probably one of the biggest crises the United Nations, the new Secretary General, second term, has to fight. So, Professor Sachs, what about the vaccines?
We need to have senior officials of China, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and India sit down around a table in the nearest days to work out a plan so that vaccine production can reach all of the world within the next 8 to 10 months. This is feasible. China has several vaccines that it is producing and using, scaling up inside China and also giving abroad. The United States has reached a rather high level of vaccine use, but the production now would go to other countries. Europe is a little bit behind in its own vaccine coverage, but it will also have very soon surplus vaccines produced to be used around the world. But what we lack is a plan of action. And the only way to get a plan of action is for the major vaccine producing countries to speak with each other. And I know that it's feasible. I've made my own plan. I took out my own spreadsheet. I made my own plan. It's not so hard to do. But unfortunately, I don't have access to all those vaccines, but the governments do. So if our governments sit down in a serious way, even within this coming week, I mean it literally, not facetiously, and say we need a plan to show the whole world that there's enough production underway so that at the end of this year or early in 2022, the vaccines can reach people everywhere. When I hear, oh, we don't want to talk to China about that, how foolish can it be? We need China, the United States, European Union to act like adults. Please, I say to my colleagues in the United States, sit down with your counterparts, please. I've been trying to do my best at a technical level to emphasize to WHO, to the US government, to the European Union, to everybody, please sit down with a spreadsheet and work this out.
Professor Sachs, now, did they explain to you why, quote unquote, they didn't want to talk to China?
I think it's a bad habit. I think that this is just a bad habit. Trump soured relations. The mood in the United States politics is anti-China, mostly out of ignorance, I should say, because the level of knowledge of the politicians is very low. But once a mood is established, it becomes quite dangerous. And I think we're in a bad mood in the United States. And it is never correct to say we don't talk, because when you talk, you resolve the problems. You understand each other. But right now, there is not sufficient discussion underway. And so this is what I say to friends and colleagues in the US government all the time, that we cannot do this without dialogue. We will not succeed unless we are working together, discussing together, solving problems together. And a good place to start is the vaccines, because it's joint problem solving, and it is absolutely our mutual interest. One could not even be so blind as to imagine that it's not our mutual interest in that regard.
That wraps up our conversation. Thank you so much for both of your contribution. Jeffrey Sachs and Fu Jun, appreciate it. Thanks.